Hi, this is Fady from Heartbeat Productions, and in today's video we will be talking about how to set up your UA Apollo units and the console with Pro Tools for routing, assigning inputs and outputs, as well as sending audio signals for in-ears or for your band in the live room. This video is a continuation of the previous video that I did with the full walkthrough through my current setup in my studio, as well as how to set up any Apollo unit at your place, how to set up multiple units, how to clock them, how to set up your I/O inputs and outputs, how to set up virtual channels, ADATs, all that kind of stuff. I highly recommend that you take a look at that video before you dig into this one, especially because in Pro Tools, you want to make sure that all of your I/Os are set up correctly before you assign anything in Pro Tools. Pro Tools also do not like if you switch anything on it, and it will refuse if the session is actually open. You cannot be changing I/Os while Pro Tools is open. So we want to make sure that our setup is exactly how we want it to be in the Apollo console before we even go to Pro Tools. And that will save you so much troubleshooting in Pro Tools and having a lot of issues with input and outputs, or creating even duplicate channels by accident. Okay, so let's dig in. I have a Pro Tools session here with us, as well as the Apollo console, and I want to go through some of the settings in Pro Tools in the Apollo console and how you can assign those, as well as how to send a signal from Pro Tools back into the Apollo unit to send back to ears for mixing purposes and monitoring purposes for musicians without having to run into any latency problems. I hope this video will be helpful for you, so stick around and let's dig in. Okay, we got here a very simple Pro Tools session, and before we dig into this, let's look really quick at the console. So right now, this is what we've talked about in the previous video. This is my I/O setup in my console. And there are certain things that I've also renamed. You can go here in easy, and then so on my outputs, I'm renaming that this is summing channel 1, summing channel 2, all the way down to channel 16. Certain things I left them the standard naming, and then right here you guys can see I renamed my Hilo converters inputs and outputs, both of them, and I'll show you guys why here in just a second inside Pro Tools. Everything else is pretty standard based on the setup that we did in the previous video. Highly recommend looking at that. Okay, now that we have this is good to go in our Apollo. I have all my channels muted right now. Let's leave them muted for this moment. Now let's go inside Pro Tools. I have a simple Pro Tools session with only right now a click, an upright piano that I tracked, and then just my master fader. So as a general rule in Pro Tools, I highly recommend before you do anything, always, even before you start working on any session, always click your setup, check your playback engine. You make sure that you are on the correct playback engine, which in this case is the Thunderbolt. Then now, second is your buffer size. And in this scenario, because we will be monitoring through the Apollo, and the Apollo offers 0 latency, so then you can run at your highest buffer size without having to worry about any latency problem, and that helps your CPU significantly. Then the next thing is ignore errors during playback and record. You always want to make sure that these are turned off, because that way you can preserve the integrity of your recording files, and you don't have any, if there's any errors that happen, Pro Tools will instantly stop and tell you something wrong happened, versus it continues telling you that we've recorded the file, and then you have pops and clicks in that file by accident. And then the rest of the settings I have to optimize and the dynamic plugin processing on. That way I can optimize my CPU. So that's the first thing, check. Now the second thing you always want to check is your I/O, Pro Tools I/O. So under setup and then I/O. And this is the one that we will be spending a little bit of time in here. In your I/O, today we'll be talking about 4 things that you would want to set up correctly: your input, your output, your bus, and your inserts. So let's start with our inputs. In inputs in here, I'm going to go ahead and delete all of it. So that way, if we're starting with a blank session. Pro Tools will recognize that this is the Universal Audio Thunderbolt device that's been connected. And I can stretch this so you can see the whole screen. Now, all what you need to do, if you go down here to default, and if you click on default, Pro Tools will populate all the inputs that you have assigned in the console I/O settings. So if I click default, it instantly pulled all the information. I have 64 channels assigned under Universal Audio console, and now it's pulling all of them. And if any of them I've renamed in the console, it will also be renamed here. So like, for example, channel 1 says virtual input 1 and 2. Channel 2, it says A, unit A, which is my X6 mic and line 1 and 2, line 3 and 4, and then here it says none, because on my IOs, I don't know if I can open my IOs really quick here. Oh, here you go. Those are both next to each other. That's great. On my IO here, you can see channel 9 and 10 are not being used. So right here, channel 9 and 10 are not being used. It says none. And then after that, everything continues going the same. When I named this input, which is input 25 and 26 Hilo, L and R, it shows here Hilo, L and R as well. It will recognize the naming, but you can also, in Pro Tools, I can double click on any of these and I can rename it to whatever I want to. And if this is a stereo input, you can click on that little arrow and it will open the two mono inputs. And I can go in here and then I would say, for example, this is my X6 mic 1 and this is X6 mic 2, and then I can rename the actual stereo channel X6 mic 1 and 2. So that way, if you're recording mono or stereo in Pro Tools, it will show whatever names you want it to show. Why is this important? Because a lot of times, especially when you have a lot of inputs and you're trying to assign inputs in your Pro Tools, if your inputs are just being named by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, all the way to 64, you'd be like, oh, which one was the Apollo X8 mic 4? And then which one was the ADAT unit that is connected to the Apollo X8 channel 7? It gets really, really messy if you don't have these labeled well enough. And you can obviously label them however makes sense to you. Here's everything for the inputs. And then again, if you see that these are totally messed up, you can easily just select all of them, delete all of them, click default, and it will basically relabel all of them from what your console, Apollo console, is labeled. Now going to outputs, you want to make sure that they are correct as well. And you guys can see here, these are also labeled the same way I have them labeled in my Apollo console. 1 and 2 is by monitor out 1 and 2. That I'm currently not using any physical outputs connected to it, but I'm using it because it's being mirrored to my SPDIF output, which is feeding my monitor controller into my speakers. Then here you can see all my summing channels, my Hilo, and everything all the way to the bottom. Now going to bus. And in bus, sometimes a lot of these get messed up, especially if you are, somebody gave you a session that they've been working on, and then they pass it on to you to mix or edit or do something. The session will remember the bus inputs and outputs of whatever the person sent to you. So then in this scenario, what you need to do is make sure that select all, you can delete, and then you can press default and it will clean the bus. And that way it's pretty clean for you and it's pulling all your console data, IOs, and all of your Apollo setup in your studio. Okay, so let's walk through this really quick here. This is all the buses that are being generated inside Pro Tools. You can see bus number 1 is this first bus is mapped to the monitors, and it's being assigned to monitor 1 and 2. One really cool thing about Pro Tools in here, if I click on this, I can tell Pro Tools that monitor 1 and 2, instead of assigning it to output 1 and 2, I want to assign it to output virtual 1 and 2 instead. So this is a really easy, quick way. Instead of switching cables or switching inputs and outputs on that physical unit, I can go here in Pro Tools and it won't affect my Apollo console IO. I can just go in here and I tell it what do I want it to be. You can also duplicate that signal to 2 different places, which I'll explain in a minute why that is helpful sometimes. And the way that you do this, you click and then you select, this one is selected. If I want to select also, let's say virtual 1 and 2, hold Control on your Mac keyboard, and then see you have a second check mark, and I can make this and this. I can check as many outputs as I'm assigning to at this point. Now that we've made sure that all of our bus is clean and organized the way it should be, now let's go to inserts. What is inserts? Inserts is something you will be using if you have hardware units. I talked about this in the previous video. This is the main reason when I explained in this in the console settings, saying you want to make sure that your inputs and outputs correspond to one another. If you're using channel number 3, this is Apollo X6 mic input 1, then on the output I will make sure it's line output 1. If I'm here, channel number 5 is line input 3, then on the outputs is line input 3. So they all correspond to one another. Why is that? Because right now in Pro Tools, I'm going to click default. You guys can see now it changed a few things for me. Let's delete all of it. Let's click default. So the inserts, Pro Tools does not pull the labels or the names from your Apollo console. You'll have to name those by yourself and then save it. Insert is Pro Tools creating a round trip audio that goes from your outputs of your interface and comes back to the input of your interface in one insert that looks like a plugin inside Pro Tools. Okay, let's create one insert right now so we can get an idea of how to do it. So I'm going to go to my console I/O, and then let's use the Hilo, because this is the main converter that I use here for all my round trip through my hardware units. So here's channel 25 and 26. Those are my Hilo through my ADAT unit, and then I have them corresponding to one another, the inputs and the outputs. Then what I need to do now, since I have that set up correctly here, I'm going to go into channel 25 and 26 here in Pro Tools, and I'm going to call this Hilo LR, which is left and right. And then Pro Tools even created LRL, LR left. Honestly, I can just call it Hilo. And then Pro Tools is going to create Hilo left and Hilo right. And then inside Pro Tools, I'll show you guys what I'm going to use this for. Okay. Now that we've walked through all the I/O preferences in Pro Tools, so we should be good to go. We have a setting. You guys see now all my outputs got grayed out because I deleted them and added them again. So I'm just going to assign this. Everything is right now is just coming through monitor output left and right. So if I play any audio right here, you guys will see it's coming through the master left and right. It also will come through the Apollo. Now that we confirmed all of that, now let's create an audio channel. So here's a mono track that we've created. Let's say we are going to use this track for tracking vocals. Now if I go to my inputs, now you can see all the inputs labeled and named, the exact labels and names that we have in Pro Tools I/O or in the Apollo console. So I actually know in my Snake, in my live room, where did I plug that vocal mic? I plugged it into my Apollo X8, which is my B unit, mic 1. So then it's easy for me to find it, know what it is. Do not make your inputs just by numbers because it gets very, very confusing. So here you go. I can really quick assign where my inputs are. So that's where your inputs are. Then your outputs, here's, for example, the piano is going to output 1 and 2, which is to my main faders. Okay, let's say we wanted to, which we've talked about this in the previous video, I want to send a mix to the musicians in their ears. So I'm gonna send them that piano, and they're gonna want to play something to that piano. So I want to make sure I create an audio channel from Pro Tools that goes back into their ears as a dedicated mix. So the way to do this, I don't want to affect the mix in my control room because I want to hear my own mix that is separate than theirs. One of the easiest way, I can go to Sends in Pro Tools, and I can go to Outputs, and I'll send it to one of the virtual instruments right here, virtual 1 and 2, or 3 and 4, doesn't matter which one. So we created virtual 1 and 2. And I'm going to turn the volume to 0. Now that I did this, when it plays, sorry, I put it on the wrong channel. Here you go. And now when it plays audio through monitor left and right as well as through virtual. And let's double check that in the console. So you guys see now that virtual 1 and 2 is receiving audio. Okay, now I want to send this to their ears. And we've talked about this in the previous video. Depending on how you have your cue set up, let's say that person is receiving Q1 mix through headphone 1. So all what I need to do, so I'm going to go here to sends Q1 and come to virtual 1 and 2 and send that to them. So now they're receiving Q1 and 2 in their ears. This is if you want to send just one individual channel for them. And then I can do same principle applied to the click. So the click is a mono channel. Let's say I want to send it in virtual 3. So that way they have the click even separate, and I have a separate mix for the click. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to go virtual 3. And I turn the volume up for that click. Let's turn the click on. And then let's separate virtual 3, make them 2 separate channels. So here's virtual 3 receiving audio, and then virtual 3, I want to send it to a different cue. They're getting that in a different mix. I'll choose what mix I want it to, and then I'll turn that virtual 3 up and down. Okay, this is great if I only am sending one channel or 2 channels. But what if I want to send the entire mix to their ears? So let's say I have here 100 channels of drums and bass and guitars and everything, and I'm tracking a vocal session, and then all what the singer need in their ears, they need a click and the entire session, all just as a stereo mix in their ears. And then they obviously will monitor their vocal mic separate. So instead of creating this virtual on every individual instrument on your whole session, which is a lot of work and takes a lot of time, what we will do is we actually go back here into the I/O and we go to bus. And remember when I said we can duplicate outputs? That's where it comes really handy. I'm going to select this and I'm going to duplicate my monitor mix, which is my session mix basically. And I'm going to duplicate that and send it, and I'm holding the control and I'm going to send it to virtual 1 and 2. And close. You guys will also see now that something has changed here in the outputs in the Pro Tools channel. It says it's being outputted to monitor A left and right and virtual 1 and 2. Even if I open this, you can see now it's being outputted to 2 things and not only 1. It's basically sending the channel twice. Now when I click play, it's going through both. It's coming through my monitor mix as well as my virtual. You'll notice here I have my virtual muted because I don't want to hear it twice in the control room, because this is how it sounds in my control room. So I have it muted, and then I'm only sending the virtual through my cue mix right here. So that way they can hear it in their ears, and what they're getting is separate than what I am getting. And again, the same principle applies, that I can easily now go into my cue outputs, into my source here, into my mix room, and then I can say, instead of I'm listening to this, I'm going to listen to Q1, and I get to hear what they are hearing to make adjustment for them or on their behalf, and then switch it back. Now that we've walked through this, let's talk about the inserts in Pro Tools. So let's say I have this upright piano. I want to process this upright piano, and I want to send it through my SSL Fusion unit. I have here a stereo SSL Fusion. Really love, use it all the time. And let's send that through it. So I'm going to go to my patch bay. So whatever patch you're using at that point. In my scenario, I use the Flock Audio patch, which I have a complete separate video just walking through this on how I'm using it. I'm assigning the helo outputs, goes into the SSL, and then it comes back into the Hilo input. And then this could be through a patch bay, or it could be through physically running wires out of your Apollo output 1 and 2, line output 1 and 2 goes into your SSL and then comes back into line input 1 and 2. Make sure it's the same output coming back into the same channel number. Now that we've agreed on this, all what I need to do for my upright, so I'm going to solo this right now, and I'm going to go here, and you see there's search, there's plugins, multi plugins for monos, and then recall, and then there's IO. And then under IO, you'll see the inserts. And in one of them, we renamed Hilo, so that way I know which one it is. I can just select this. And all what that does right now, it basically tells Pro Tools to send the audio signal from the upright piano into the SSL and back into the same channel. I do not have to create the old school way. It used to be I changed the output here into output 1 and 2, create a second audio channel, receive the input from input 1 and 2, and print it. But now I don't have to do this. I just do it this way. Now if I play this, that input right now is passing. That input right now, what you guys are seeing, is actually going through my SSL unit. I'm processing through the SSL unit or not processing through the SSL unit. Also, because it's an insert, I have control on where does that round trip travel happens. So let's say I have an EQ. I want to EQ it first. I use the Fat Filter. I like their EQ a lot. Let's say I want to cut some of these mids right here. And then I want to put a dynamic compression right here. So I want to EQ it first before I send it to the SSL. So I'll put the EQ as my first insert, and then I will put my conversion here to the SSL, the round trip. And then that way, I'm choosing when am I using my hardware plugins and inserts for processing. This for me is a game changer. And the reason why is because now I can mix hybrid, and which I do all the time. I can go to this vocal channel, and then I can go in here, and I can go to IO, and I'm going to use insert 27. And then in my insert 27, I know that, and I can rename it, that this is, for example, my API left channel, or this is my 542 tape saturation unit. And then I'm basically using my analog units as just a plugin inside Pro Tools. And you can add multiple inserts on the same channel. So let's say this is going through my Neve tape saturation, insert 27, and let's say insert 28 is going through my Pultec EQ. And I can just, and obviously you can rename them. I can even rename them from here really quick. Right click and rename, and I'm going to call this tape. And I'm going to call this Pultec. And these are not actual plugins because you see there's nothing to control. These are just basically round trip latency that is going to your hardware units. And once you're done, and you can print it now, printing is so easy now. Because all what you need to do, I'm going to right click on Hilo right here. And I'm going to say commit up to this insert. And all what it's going to do, it's going to print the same way that Pro Tools print, but it's going to have to print it in real time, not offline, because there is no offline when you're printing an actual unit. So if we do this right now, and I'm telling it hide and make inactive the original track, and print. And now that that file is being printed, here's the new file with the SSL committed on it. I hope this is helpful, and I hope this helped to clear out how to assign and route your Apollo units into Pro Tools inputs, outputs, buses, and hardware inserts. This is crucial for you to have a great workflow and not to have messed up inputs and outputs, and then you have some channels you don't know where they're going, and then just to organize your work, and you can work so much faster that way. Also, the inserts options in Pro Tools, it's a game changer for me, because then I can use any of my hardware units, and I can so easy just process a round trip through it with no latency. and then get the results that I want from actual hardware units and print them pretty simple and easy in mixing. Especially if you don't have a lot of hardware units. Let's say you have a Pultec EQ. You want to process that on your bass and your vocals and your acoustic guitar. So you just put it as an insert on your bass until you like it, print it, and then put it another insert, same insert, put it again on your acoustic guitar, adjust your Pultec settings, and then process it again and again. And then sometimes I even put an insert on my mix buses. On my drum bus, like all the times I love doing this, I would grab my drum bus and I put my API stereo bus as on my entire drum bus because it sounds amazing, and then I would just print it or mix it in real time. I don't have to print it. If I'm not going to use that API somewhere else, I don't have to print it. I'll just leave it in real time and mix with it in real time, depending on how many hardware units you have and how much is available for you to be using for your session. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions about how to continue setting up your Apollo with your unit, make sure you throw a comment down there and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you guys have. If you love this video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you guys at the next one.